It was a crisp morning in a small, quiet town where everyone knew each other's names. The type of place where secrets had a way of sneaking into whispered conversations of the local diner. The courthouse loomed large in the town square, a symbol of justice, but not always fairness. Inside, a storm was brewing that no one could have predicted. Officer Ben Carter was well known in town, and not for the reasons a police officer should be. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with a sharp uniform, Ben was the picture of authority, but his reputation was marred by whispers of bias and heavy-handed tactics. He always wore a cocky smirk, a subtle reminder to everyone that he felt untouchable. Ben wasn't the kind of man who hid his disdain for those he deemed lesser, and unfortunately, that disdain seemed most directed at the black residents of the town. It wasn't just the way he pulled over more black drivers or how his tone would change when addressing someone with darker skin. It was deeper than that. Stories had circulated of him being unnecessarily rough during arrests or speaking with a venomous tone that left people seething with anger, but powerless to fight back. Many tried to file complaints, but they seemed to vanish into thin air, never to be addressed. The system had Ben's back, or so he thought. Across town, a new judge had quietly taken her place on the bench. Judge Maya Anderson was a woman of grace, intelligence, and unyielding fairness. She had grown up in a city far larger than this one, earning her law degree with a determination born out of countless struggles. Maya knew what it felt like to be judged before speaking a single word, to walk into rooms where her presence alone was enough to make others uncomfortable. But she had turned every setback into fuel, rising to her position not because of her skin color, but in spite of the barriers it often created. Her arrival in town had been met with curiosity and skepticism. Some admired her qualifications, while others whispered that she was too different for the role. Maya didn't let the murmurs distract her. She had come to serve justice, plain and simple. The tension between these two figures, Ben with his unchecked authority, and Maya, with her quiet strength, was inevitable. Their paths crossed for the first time one fateful afternoon when a case landed on her docket. At first glance, it seemed routine. A young black man arrested for resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. But as Maya read through the police report, something didn't sit right. The language was too harsh, the details too vague. She had seen reports like this before, and they almost always told only one side of the story. Then she noticed who had made the arrest. Officer Ben Carter. Her chest tightened as a familiar frustration bubbled up. This was more than just another case. It was a challenge to her resolve, a chance to show the town that justice didn't bow to power or prejudice. In the courtroom, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Ben sat confidently at the witness stand, his smirk firmly in place. He had been in court plenty of times before, and had no doubt this would be another easy win. Maya, however, was not like any judge she had encountered. Her piercing gaze seemed to strip away his bravado, leaving a flicker of unease in its place. As the proceedings began, it became clear that this was no ordinary hearing. Maya's questions were sharp and precise, cutting through the rehearsed answers Ben provided. She noticed the subtle shifts in his demeanor, how his voice grew defensive and his answers more evasive when she probed deeper. The young man's attorney presented evidence that painted a starkly different picture from Ben's report. There were witnesses, people who had seen what happened and were brave enough to come forward. Their testimonies contradicted Ben's version of events, shedding light on a pattern of behavior that could no longer be ignored. Ben's confident smirk began to falter as Maya leaned forward, her voice steady and calm. "Officer Carter," she said, her words hanging in the air like a warning. "Do you believe that justice is about truth or about power?" The courtroom fell silent, every eye fixed on the two of them. Ben hesitated, the weight of her question pressing down on him. This wasn't going the way he had planned. And then Maya said something that sent a ripple through the room, a statement so unexpected and bold that even Ben's face betrayed his shock. The trial wasn't just about the young man. It was about exposing a system that allowed men like Ben to operate without accountability. What happened next would shake the foundations of the town, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, bias, and the power of change. The room seemed to hold its breath as Judge Maya Anderson's words echoed in the air. For a split second, Officer Ben Carter felt something he hadn't experienced in years: vulnerability. He glanced around the courtroom, hoping to find a reassuring nod from his supporters, but the faces staring back at him were either impassive or tinged with curiosity. Maya leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression unreadable, but her silence was deliberate. She wanted him to feel the weight of the moment, the gravity of what was unfolding. Ben shifted uncomfortably in his seat, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. It was the first crack in the armor he so carefully maintained. Maya turned her attention to the defendant, a young man named Jamal Harris. He was barely 20, his wide eyes a mixture of fear and defiance. His mother sat behind him, clutching her purse tightly as though it were the only thing anchoring her to the room. Jamal had grown up in this town, attending the same schools as most of the people now sitting in judgment of him. But his experience was starkly different from theirs. Jamal's attorney, a sharp-witted woman named Dana, stood and began laying out the details of the case. She painted a picture of a boy walking home from a late shift at a fast food restaurant, a hoodie pulled up to ward off the chill of the night. He had his headphones on, lost in his music, when Officer Carter's squad car pulled up. The officer claimed Jamal matched the description of a robbery suspect. What followed was a series of escalating actions: demands to see ID, accusations when Jamal hesitated to remove his hands from his pockets, and finally a scuffle that left Jamal bruised and handcuffed on the ground. The charge of resisting arrest had been tacked on for good measure, a common tactic to justify excessive force. As Dana spoke, Maya noticed the subtle shifts in the audience. Some nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting personal experiences that mirrored Jamal's. Others sat stiffly, their expressions betraying a reluctance to acknowledge what was being implied. Ben listened with a growing sense of irritation. He had told this story a dozen times before, and it had always worked. He had even rehearsed it with his colleagues, fine-tuning the details to ensure his actions appeared justified. But now, for the first time, his narrative was being questioned, not by some activist or journalist, but by the system he thought would always protect him. Maya interjected, her tone calm but firm. "Officer Carter, you've made several arrests in your career, many of which involve similar charges. Can you explain why so many of these incidents seem to involve young black men?" The question landed like a punch. Ben opened his mouth to respond, but his usual confidence failed him. "It's not about race, Your Honor," he said, his voice lacking its usual conviction. "I follow the evidence, and I enforce the law. That's my job." Maya tilted her head slightly, studying him. "And yet, the evidence in this case is questionable at best. No stolen items were found on Mr. Harris. The so-called suspect description is vague enough to apply to half the young men in this town. And your report, Officer Carter, it lacks crucial details that would support your claims. Why is that?" The courtroom grew even quieter, if that were possible. Maya's words weren't just probing. They were peeling back layers of the story that had been told too many times without challenge. Meanwhile, Jamal sat motionless, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He had never been in trouble before, never even had a detention in school. His mother had always warned him to be careful around the police, to avoid giving them any reason to single him out. But it hadn't mattered. That night, all it had taken was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maya's gaze turned toward Dana, signaling her to continue. Dana introduced the first witness, a middle-aged man named Mr. Everett. He owned the corner store near where the incident took place and had seen the entire exchange through the window. "I've lived in this town for over 30 years, Mr. Everett began, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "I've seen my fair share of good cops and bad ones. That night, I saw a boy walking home, minding his own business. And then I saw Officer Carter pull up. It didn't look like he was asking questions. It looked like he'd already decided this boy was guilty of something." Ben shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. "That's not true," he muttered under his breath. But Maya's sharp glance silenced him. Mr. Everett continued, describing how Jamal had seemed confused and scared, how he had hesitated to move too quickly because he didn't want to appear threatening. It all happened so fast, Everett said. One second, the boy was standing there, and the next, he was on the ground. It didn't look right. It didn't feel right. Dana thanked the witness and called another, a young woman who had been walking her dog nearby. Her account echoed Mr. Everett's, further unraveling Ben's version of events. With each testimony, the tension in the room grew. Ben's smirk was long gone, replaced by a clenched jaw and narrowed eyes. He felt trapped, like an animal backed into a corner. Maya, however, remained composed. She had seen cases like this before, knew the patterns, the excuses, the justifications. But she also knew how fragile this moment was. A misstep could derail everything, could allow the system to close ranks and protect one of its own. The day ended without a resolution, the case adjourned until the following week, but the undercurrent of change was undeniable. As people filed out of the courtroom, conversations buzzed with questions and realizations. For the first time, it felt like the truth might actually see the light of day. Back in her chambers, Maya sat alone, her hands folded neatly on the desk. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The system didn't like to admit its flaws, and people like Ben Carter didn't change without a fight. But as she thought about Jamal and his mother, about the witnesses who had spoken up despite the risks, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This case wasn't just about one officer or one young man. It was about something much bigger, a fight for fairness, accountability, and the kind of justice that didn't bend to power or prejudice. Outside, the town buzzed with speculation. Some supported Maya's tough questions, while others grumbled about her challenging an officer's authority. The tension wasn't just in the courtroom anymore. It was in the streets, the homes, the hearts of everyone who had been watching. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the courthouse, one thing was clear: the battle had only just begun. The days following the courtroom session were anything but quiet. The town, once so accustomed to its rhythms, now found itself at the center of a growing storm. Conversations that had been whispered in private spaces now spilled out into the open, on sidewalks, in diners, and across social media. Everyone seemed to have an opinion, but not everyone was willing to confront the deeper truths about what the case represented. Officer Ben Carter tried to go about his routine as if nothing had changed, but the cracks in his confidence were beginning to show. Each time he walked into the station, he could feel the weight of his colleagues' eyes on him. Some gave him subtle nods of support, while others avoided him entirely, not wanting to get caught in the fallout. He spent his evenings pacing his small apartment, replaying the courtroom exchanges in his mind. He told himself he was the victim here, a good cop being unfairly scrutinized for doing his job. But in the quiet moments, when there was no one around to validate him, doubt crept in. Meanwhile, Maya Anderson prepared for the next hearing with a growing sense of determination. She knew that her role as a judge wasn't to take sides, but she also knew the power of asking the right questions. The courtroom wasn't just a space for legal arguments, it was a space for truth, and the truth in this case was beginning to emerge like sunlight through cracks in a wall. Jamal Harris and his mother were trying to navigate their own storm. The attention was overwhelming, and the strain of the situation weighed heavily on them. Jamal hadn't been able to return to work, and the whispers in the community made even a trip to the grocery store feel unbearable. Some people offered quiet support, while others looked at them with a mix of suspicion and pity. Jamal's mother, strong as she was, spent her nights worrying about her son's future. "They're trying to paint you as a troublemaker," she told him one evening, her voice heavy with both love and fear. "But you have to stay strong, Jamal. We're going to get through this." On the other side of town, Dana, Jamal's attorney, worked tirelessly to piece together a case that would expose the truth. She knew the stakes were high, not just for Jamal, but for everyone who had ever been silenced or ignored in the face of injustice. She spent hours reviewing records, looking for patterns in Ben Carter's arrests that would reveal a broader issue. What she found was both unsurprising and damning. A history of disproportionately targeting black residents, with vague charges that often didn't hold up in court. Dana also met with more witnesses, people who had experienced or seen Ben's heavy-handed tactics firsthand. One man, an older black resident named Mr. Jenkins, shared a story of being pulled over by Ben for a broken taillight that wasn't broken at all. "He wanted to intimidate me," Mr. Jenkins said, his voice tinged with quiet anger. "Made me feel like I didn't belong in my own town." Dana listened carefully, a resolve growing with each story. But not everyone was eager to see the case through to its conclusion. Behind the scenes, whispers of pressure and influence began to surface. Powerful figures in the community, business owners, local politicians, and even some within the police department, started to express concern about the attention the case was drawing. They worried it would tarnish the town's image, disrupt the delicate balance of power, and bring scrutiny they weren't prepared for. One evening, Maya received an unannounced visitor at her office. Chief Howard, the head of the police department. He was an older man, with a calm demeanor that masked a sharp mind. He claimed his visit was simply to check in and see how the case was progressing, but Maya knew better. His questions were carefully worded, his tone neutral, but there was an underlying message: tread lightly. "I trust you'll handle this fairly, Judge Anderson," Chief Howard said, his voice steady but with a hint of warning. "We all want what's best for the town." Maya met his gaze, unflinching. "Fairness is exactly what I intend to deliver, Chief. Nothing more, nothing less." He nodded, offering a tight smile before leaving, but the encounter left Maya unsettled. It was a reminder that the fight for justice wasn't just in the courtroom. It was against the system that resisted change at every turn. As the case unfolded, the town's divisions became more pronounced. Some residents rallied around Maya, Jamal, and the witnesses, seeing the case as an opportunity to confront long-standing issues of bias and inequality. Others doubled down on their support for Ben, framing the case as an attack on law enforcement and the values they believed the town stood for. The tension reached a boiling point one afternoon when a small protest formed outside the courthouse. On one side, a group held signs demanding justice for Jamal, their voices loud but resolute. On the other, a smaller but equally vocal group stood in support of Officer Carter, waving signs that read "Back the Blue" and "Justice for Ben." The two groups faced off, their chants and arguments filling the air, while police officers stood by to keep the peace. Maya watched from her office window, her heart heavy. She had known this case would stir emotions, but seeing the divide so clearly laid out was sobering. This wasn't just about one officer or one young man. It was about the soul of the town, and whether it could face its own reflection. That night, Ben sat alone in his apartment, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. He felt the walls closing in, the once unshakable confidence now eroded by doubt and fear. He thought about his father, a decorated officer who had always taught him that the badge stood for honor and integrity. "Never lose sight of what's right, son," his father had said. But Ben couldn't help but wonder if he'd lost sight long ago. Jamal, too, found himself lost in thought. He sat on the edge of his bed, holding a small photo of him and his father, taken years ago before his father passed away. His father had always told him to stand tall, no matter what, but the weight of the case, the scrutiny, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead made it hard to breathe. He didn't know if he had the strength to keep going, but he knew he didn't have a choice. And so the town braced itself for what was to come. The next hearing was just days away, and the tension in the air was almost palpable. Everyone, Maya, Ben, Jamal, Dana, and the townspeople, was caught in a web of truth, lies, and the possibility of change. But as the lines between right and wrong blurred, one thing remained certain. The battle was far from over, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The courthouse was packed when the trial resumed, every seat in the gallery taken, with more people standing along the walls and spilling to the hallway. The tension in the air was almost suffocating, a mixture of curiosity, outrage, and anticipation. Everyone wanted to know how this was going to play out. Judge Maya Anderson entered the courtroom, her presence commanding immediate silence. She took her seat, scanning the room briefly. Her expression was calm, but her mind was racing. Today would be pivotal, and she knew that every word spoken could tip the scales. Dana stood confidently, ready to present her most compelling evidence yet. She had spent the past week uncovering documents and finding more witnesses, each piece of the puzzle fitting together in a way that exposed a pattern too glaring to ignore. She called her next witness, a former officer who had once worked alongside Ben Carter. The man, a wiry figure with tired eyes, walked to the stand with hesitation. He adjusted his tie nervously, avoiding Ben's glare as he took the oath. When Dana began her questioning, his answers were cautious at first, as if he was measuring every word. But as she pressed, his walls began to crumble. He revealed details that made the courtroom buzz with murmurs. He spoke about unwritten practices, the way certain officers were encouraged to patrol specific neighborhoods more aggressively, how matching in description often became a catch-all excuse to justify targeting young black men. Though he never directly accused Ben of outright racism, implications were clear. Ben's face reddened, his jaw clenched as he sat rigidly at the defense table. He whispered something to his attorney, who looked equally unsettled. This wasn't part of the plan. The narrative Ben had relied on for years was unraveling before his eyes, and he could feel the weight of every stare in the room. Dana wasn't finished. She introduced body camera footage obtained from a public records request. The video showed a prior arrest Ben had made 6 months earlier, eerily similar to Jamal's case. In the footage, Ben's tone was harsh, his commands abrupt, and the young man he had detained appeared confused and frightened. While the incident hadn't escalated to physical force, it painted a troubling picture of bias and aggression. The gallery erupted into whispers as the footage played, the images undeniable. Even Maya, who had trained herself to remain neutral, felt a pang of anger as she watched. This wasn't just about one bad night or a single misunderstanding. This was about a pattern that had gone unchecked for far too long. When it was Ben's turn to testify, the room grew so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the courthouse lights. He took the stand with a practiced air of confidence, but it was clear he was rattled. His attorney guided him through his testimony, framing him as a dedicated officer who had made difficult decisions in high-pressure situations. "I don't target anyone," Ben said, his voice steady but defensive. "I enforce the law. That's my job. If someone looks suspicious, I have a duty to investigate. It's not about race, it's about safety." Dana stood for cross-examination, her expression sharp and unyielding. She began by asking about the discrepancies in Ben's reports, the lack of evidence in Jamal's case, and the suspiciously similar language used in multiple arrests he'd made over the years. Ben's answers grew more clipped, his frustration mounting as Dana poked holes in his narrative. Then came the question that silenced the room. "Officer Carter," Dana said, her voice calm but piercing, "have you ever stopped to consider why so many of your arrests follow this pattern? Why so many of your reports involve young black men, even in situations where no crime was committed?" Ben hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for a response. The silence stretched, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Finally, he said, "I don't make the rules. I enforce them." It was a weak answer, and everyone in the room knew it. Dana stepped back, letting the words hang in the air. Maya watched Ben closely, her sharp eyes taking in every flicker of emotion on his face. The final piece of evidence was presented, a series of internal emails obtained anonymously. They showed that complaints had been filed against Ben before, not just from civilians but from fellow officers. The complaints detailed concerns about his behavior, his language, and his attitude towards certain communities. But none of them had gone anywhere. The system had protected him, burying the reports and allowing him to continue unchecked. By the time the prosecution rested, the courtroom was simmering with tension. The defense scrambled to counter, calling character witnesses who painted Ben as a hard-working, honorable officer. But the cracks were too wide to ignore, and even the most sympathetic accounts couldn't fully erase what had been revealed. As the day drew to a close, Maya announced that closing arguments would be heard the following morning. The courtroom emptied slowly, the weight of what had transpired settling heavily on everyone who had witnessed it. Outside, the crowd had grown even larger. Reporters with cameras and microphones pressed for statements, while protesters on both sides raised their voices, their signs held high. The divide in the town was impossible to ignore now, and it felt like everyone was waiting for the next shoe to drop. That night, Maya sat in her office long after the courthouse had emptied. The evidence was damning, and the implications were massive. She knew her decision would send ripples far beyond this one case. It wasn't just about Jamal or Ben. It was about trust in the justice system, the community's willingness to change, and whether power would finally be held accountable. Across town, Ben sat alone in his darkened apartment, staring at his badge on the coffee table. It used to represent pride, authority, and purpose. Now it felt like a weight, a symbol of everything he was about to lose. He thought about calling someone, anyone, but he knew no one could help him now. And Jamal, lying awake in his small bedroom, wondered if this would finally be the moment things changed, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless against the system. He didn't know if he believed in justice anymore, but he hoped Maya did. The stage was set for the climax, the tension wound tighter than ever. As the sun rose over the town, painting the courthouse in shades of gold and amber, everyone braced themselves for what was to come. The truth had been exposed, but whether it would lead to justice remained to be seen. The morning of the final courtroom session was thick with tension. People crowded outside the courthouse even earlier than before, the divide between supporters of Ben and those standing with Jamal more evident than ever. Reporters pushed microphones toward anyone willing to speak, capturing every soundbite for an audience eager to consume the drama. Inside, the air was cooler, quieter, but no less heavy with anticipation. Judge Maya Anderson entered the courtroom promptly, her expression unreadable. She glanced at the packed gallery, noting familiar faces and a few new ones. She had heard whispers of increased pressure behind the scenes, rumors of influence being exerted, deals being suggested. But she refused to let them sway her. The weight of the case pressed on her shoulders, but she carried it without faltering. Dana stood with confidence as she prepared her final arguments, her mind sharp despite the sleepless night she'd spent reviewing her notes. She had one last card to play, and it was risky. Just as the defense was about to give their closing argument, Dana requested permission to call an unexpected witness. The room shifted as murmurs spread, people craning their necks to see who it might be. A young woman entered the courtroom, her face pale but determined. She was introduced as a former dispatcher for the police department, and her presence sent ripples of unease through the defense table. Ben's attorney immediately objected, arguing that the witness was irrelevant and her testimony outside the scope of the trial. But Dana was prepared, and after a brief back and forth, Judge Anderson allowed the testimony. The woman took the stand, her voice trembling at first as she recounted her time working alongside officers, including Ben Carter. She described how calls from certain neighborhoods were handled differently, with officers responding more aggressively based on unspoken assumptions. But what caught everyone's attention was when she revealed something chilling. A series of audio recordings she had secretly saved. Dana introduced the recordings as evidence, and the courtroom fell into an eerie silence as the first clip played. It was a conversation between Ben and another officer, filled with derogatory language and casual remarks about targeting problem areas to keep them in line. The words were sharp, cutting through any illusion of impartiality or professionalism. Ben's face turned ashen as the recordings continued. He sat rigidly, his attorney whispering furiously in his ear, but there was no way to deny what the jury was hearing. The courtroom was frozen, every person hanging on to each word, as the recordings painted a damning picture of systemic bias and abuse of power. When the recordings ended, Dana let the silence linger for a moment before speaking. This is not just about one man's actions. This is about a system that has allowed those actions to go unchecked for far too long. Her voice was steady but laced with emotion, and for the first time, even some of Ben's staunchest supporters in the gallery seemed to waver. As the defense scrambled to recover, Introducing character witnesses and reframing the narrative, a second twist emerged, one that no one saw coming. During a recess, a man approached Dana, asking to speak privately. He identified himself as a retired officer who had worked with Ben early in his career. Dana hesitated, unsure if this was a genuine gesture or a ploy, but something in his tone convinced her to listen. The man revealed that Ben's behavior wasn't new. It had been escalating for years. He admitted that he had once filed a formal complaint against Ben, citing concerns about his treatment of minority communities, but the complaint had been quietly dismissed. The man offered to testify, knowing the risk it posed to his own reputation, because, as he put it, enough is enough. Dana wasted no time. She presented the new witness, and his testimony was like throwing gasoline on an already raging fire. He detailed the culture of silence within the department, how complaints were buried to protect officers and maintain the status quo. He admitted his own complicity, saying he had been afraid to push harder at the time, but now wanted to make things right. The courtroom buzzed with tension, the stakes rising higher with each revelation. Ben's attorney tried to discredit the new witness, questioning his motives and reliability, but the damage was done. Even some of the jurors seemed visibly shaken, their expressions betraying the weight of what they were hearing. As the day drew to a close, the courtroom felt like it was teetering on the edge of an explosion. The evidence, the testimonies, the recordings, all of it had created a storm that no one could ignore. Outside, the crowd had grown louder, their chants echoing through the courthouse walls. Ben sat at the defense table, his confidence shattered, his mind racing. He thought about his father's words again, about honor and integrity, and wondered how things had spiraled so far out of control. For the first time, he felt the weight of accountability pressing down on him, suffocating and inescapable. Maya leaned back in her chair as the courtroom emptied for the day, her thoughts swirling. The case had taken a turn she hadn't expected, and the stakes were now higher than ever. She knew the community was watching, waiting for her decision, but the truth was far more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. As the sun set over the courthouse, painting the sky in fiery hues, the town braced itself for the climax of a battle that had revealed more than anyone was ready to face. The cracks in the system were no longer hidden, and the question remained, would they be repaired, or would they break the town apart? The final day of the trial arrived with a heavy stillness in the air. The courtroom was at capacity, the gallery filled with faces both hopeful and apprehensive. Outside, the crowd had doubled overnight, voices chanting for justice echoing through the streets. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a defining moment, a battle for accountability and change that carried the weight of the entire community. Judge Maya Anderson entered the room with her usual composure, but there was a distinct gravity to her movements. She took her seat, her gaze steady as she scanned the room. She was acutely aware that her decision would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Jamal and Ben, but for the system that had brought them to this point. Dana opened her closing arguments with a precision that was equal parts logic and emotion. She didn't just recount the evidence, she painted a picture of a broken system that had allowed prejudice to thrive unchecked. She spoke of the pain and fear experienced by those unfairly targeted and the urgent need for accountability. Her words landed with a force that left the gallery silent, her passion unrelenting as she declared, "This trial is not about tearing down one man. It's about standing up for what is right." The defense attorney countered with a narrative of redemption, portraying Ben as a man caught in the crosshairs of a flawed system. He argued that Ben was not a villain, but a victim of circumstances, a hard-working officer whose actions were misinterpreted. While his words were polished, they lacked the resonance of Dana's argument. Even so, he ended with an appeal to the jury's sense of fairness, hoping to plant just enough doubt. The jury deliberated for hours, and each passing moment heightened the tension in the courtroom. People whispered anxiously, their eyes darting between the clock and the closed jury door. Ben sat hunched over at the defense table, his once proud posture now replaced by visible exhaustion. Jamal sat nearby, his hands clasped tightly together as he stared at the floor, silently willing the scales of justice to tip in his favor. When the jury finally returned, The room fell silent. Each juror's expression was unreadable as they handed the verdict to the court clerk, who passed it to Maya. She unfolded the paper and read it silently, her face impassive. The gallery held its collective breath as she began to speak. The jury had found Ben Carter guilty of misconduct and unlawful arrest. The courtroom erupted, half in cheers, half in stunned disbelief. Outside, the news spread like wildfire, the crowd's chants growing louder as they celebrated a victory many had doubted they would see. Gemmel's eyes welled with tears as he realized the weight that had been lifted from his shoulders. Dana placed a reassuring hand on his arm, a rare smile breaking through her usually serious demeanor. But just as the room began to settle, Maya raised her hand for silence. There was one more matter to address, she said, her voice calm but firm. She had reviewed the anonymous complaints and the evidence of systemic failures within the police department. What she had found was deeply troubling, and she could not, in good conscience, let it go unaddressed. In an unexpected twist, Maya announced that she was ordering a formal investigation into the department's practices and oversight. The courtroom buzzed with shock. This wasn't just about Ben anymore. It was about dismantling the very system that had allowed him to operate unchecked. The decision sent ripples through the room, leaving some angry, others vindicated, but all aware that this moment was bigger than any one person. As the session ended, Ben was led away in handcuffs, his head hanging low. For the first time, he'd felt the full weight of the choices he had made. Meanwhile, Gemmell stepped outside into the sunlight, the crowd erupting into applause as he walked down the courthouse steps. He looked out at the sea of faces and felt a glimmer of hope, not just for himself, but for everyone who had fought for this moment. Maya stayed behind in her chambers, the cheers from outside faint through the thick walls. She sat at her desk, her hands clasped in front of her as she stared out the window. The case was over, but she knew the work was far from done. Change was never easy, but this was a start. And sometimes a start was all you needed.